A mountain man saves a starving woman in the middle of a freezing storm. But the next day, 20 starving children appear at his door, shaking, hungry, and calling her their leader. In a single night, his quiet life turns into a battlefield of danger and mercy. As the church bell echoes through the valley and snow gathers on his roof, he learns a dark truth. Someone powerful is hunting these children, wanting to use them as tools of war. Hoofbeats rumble in the distance, a militia riding closer, and the woman he just saved carries a secret that could cost every one of those children their lives. Now the mountain man must decide. Will he stand against the storm coming for them, or lose the only family he never knew he needed? What happens when 20 starving children show up on a lonely mountain doorstep, begging to be saved before the riders arrive? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. Through the howling wind and thickening snow, Beck McAllister urged his horse forward along the familiar trail to his line shack. The late afternoon light was already fading fast, casting long shadows across the pristine white drifts. His trained eye noted how the fresh powder had nearly obscured his outbound tracks from earlier that day when he'd checked his trap lines. The temperature was dropping quick. Too quick. Beck pulled his buffalo coat tighter around his broad shoulders and patted his horse's neck. "Easy there, Scout," he murmured, as the gelding's hooves crunched through the crusty surface of older snow beneath. Almost home. 20 years in these mountains had taught Beck to read the weather like most men read newspapers. This storm was settling in for the long haul, the kind that could trap a man indoors for days. His line shack wasn't much, just a simple one-room cabin with a pot-bellied stove, rough-hewn table, and narrow bunk. But it was solid shelter against the fierce elements. Through the swirling white, Beck caught sight of something that made him pull Scout to a halt. There, cutting across his path at an odd angle, was a set of tracks he hadn't seen on his outbound journey. Human tracks, stumbling and uneven, already half buried by the fresh snow. Beck frowned, his weather-worn face creasing with concern. No one should be up this high in the San Juans with a storm rolling in, not unless they were desperate or running from something. He swung down from the saddle, his boots sinking ankle-deep in snow as he studied the trail. The tracks were fresh, maybe an hour old at most. Whoever made them was traveling light. The impressions weren't deep enough for someone carrying proper gear, and the wandering pattern told its own story. This was someone near the end of their strength. "What do you reckon, Scout?" Beck murmured to his horse. "Might be nothing but trouble." But even as he said it, he was already leading Scout in the direction the tracks led. 20 years of solitude hadn't completely frozen his conscience. The wind cut sharp as a knife blade as Beck followed the meandering trail. The tracks led toward a stand of towering pines, their branches heavy with snow. As he drew closer, his keen eyes caught movement, or rather, the absence of movement where there should have been some. There, collapsed beside a fallen pine, lay a figure nearly invisible under a dusting of white. Beck's long strides ate up the distance between them. As he approached, he could see it was a woman, curled tight against the brutal cold. Her clothes were wholly inadequate for the mountain weather. A thin coat, worn boots, no gloves. He knelt beside her, brushing snow from her face. She was young, maybe early 30s, with dark hair escaped from what had once been a neat bun. Her skin was pale as the snow around her, but he could see the slight movement of her chest, still breathing. "Ma'am?" Beck touched her shoulder gently. "Can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered, revealing eyes the color of summer storm clouds. They struggled to focus on his face. Her lips, blue with cold, moved slightly. Beck leaned closer to hear her whispered words. "The little ones?" Then her eyes slid shut again. There was no time to waste asking questions. Beck shrugged out of his buffalo coat and wrapped it around her slight form. She was light, too light, as he lifted her in his arms. Starvation had clearly taken its toll before the cold could claim her. Getting her onto Scout's back took some doing, but Beck had learned a thing or two about managing awkward burdens in his years as an Army Scout. He mounted behind her, keeping one arm secure around her waist as he turned Scout toward home. The storm seemed to fight them every step of the way. The wind drove ice crystals into Beck's face, and without his coat, the cold bit deep. But Scout knew the way, and Beck trusted his horse's instincts more than his own snow-blind eyes. Finally, the dark bulk of the line shack loomed through the whiteness. Beck had never been so glad to see its rough-hewn walls. He dismounted carefully, lifting the woman down before leading Scout into the lean-to shelter beside the cabin. He worked quickly to remove the horse's tack and rub him down, knowing Scout had earned extra care today. The woman hadn't stirred during their journey. Beck carried her into the cabin, laying her gently on the floor near the pot-bellied stove. The fire had burned low during his absence, but he soon had it blazing again, feeding it with split pine logs from his well-stocked woodbox. As warmth began to fill the small space, Beck turned his attention to his unexpected guest. He removed her sodden boots and socks, checking her feet for frostbite. The flesh was red and swollen, but hadn't begun to blacken. A good sign. His years as a scout had taught him how to treat cold injuries. He knew better than to warm her too, quickly. He wrapped her feet in clean cloths and covered her with his warmest blankets, leaving his buffalo coat around her shoulders. Then he set about heating broth from his stores of dried meat and vegetables. The rich smell soon filled the cabin, mixing with the pine smoke from the fire. As he worked, Beck studied the woman's face in the growing firelight. There was a strength there, even in unconsciousness, something in the set of her jaw, the tiny lines at the corners of her eyes that spoke of someone used to carrying heavy burdens. But there was gentleness, too, in the curve of her mouth, the delicate arch of her brows. What had driven her up into these mountains, alone and unprepared? And what had she meant about the little ones? A soft moan drew his attention. The woman's eyes opened, clearer now but still clouded with exhaustion and pain. She tried to sit up, but Beck moved quickly to her side, placing a steady hand on her shoulder. "Best lie still," he said quietly. "You're safe here, but you need to rest." She blinked at him, confusion evident on her face. "Where?" "My line shack," Beck explained. "Found you out in the storm. I'm Beck McAllister." She swallowed hard, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Mara," she managed before a fit of coughing took her. Beck supported her head, helping her sip water from his tin cup. "Just Mara?" But she had already slipped back into unconsciousness, her body demanding the rest it desperately needed. Beck tucked the blankets more securely around her and returned to tending the fire and the simmering broth. Outside, the storm raged on, rattling the cabin's shutters and howling down the chimney. Beck settled into his chair, prepared for a long night of watching over his mysterious guest. He'd lived alone in these mountains for 2 decades, seeking solitude after the things he'd seen and done during his scouting days. Now trouble had quite literally landed on his doorstep in the form of this half-frozen woman named Mara. The fire popped and hissed, casting dancing shadows on the cabin's walls. Beck's weathered hands absently stroked his graying beard as he considered his situation. Come morning, he'd need answers, about where she'd come from, who might be looking for her, and most importantly, who the little ones were. But for now, he had done what any decent man would do, offered shelter from the storm. Hours passed slowly. Beck dozed lightly in his chair, years of frontier living having taught him to sleep with one ear open. Every so often he would rise to add wood to the fire or check on Mara's breathing. Her color had improved, and some of the pinched look of cold had eased from her face. Sometimes she would stir, muttering words he couldn't quite catch, her hands clutching at the blankets as if reaching for something or someone. Each time, Beck would speak quietly, assuring her she was safe, and she would settle again. The wind continued its assault on the cabins, walls, and Beck found his thoughts turning to the past he'd tried so hard to leave behind. 20 years ago, he'd walked away from civilization after witnessing too many atrocities during his time as an army scout. The massacre of that Ute family still haunted his dreams. He should have done more to stop Harlan and his men, should have spoken up sooner. He'd chosen isolation as his penance, trading human company for the honest simplicity of mountain life. But now, watching this wounded stranger sleep in his cabin, he wondered if perhaps the mountains had other plans for him. As midnight approached, the storm showed no signs of weakening. Beck added more wood to the fire and settled back in his chair, prepared to keep his vigil until dawn. Whatever trouble Mara was running from, whatever burden she carried about the little ones, it would have to wait until morning. For now she was safe, warm, and healing, and that would have to be enough. The tin cup sitting on the rough-hewn table caught the firelight, reminding Beck that he should try to get some broth into her when she next woke. She was dangerously thin, and he knew from experience that recovery from exposure required strength. His stores were adequate but simple: dried meat, beans, coffee, and some preserved vegetables. He'd make do, as he always had. The night deepened, and still the storm raged on. Beck found himself studying Mara's face in the flickering light, trying to read the story written there. Life had clearly dealt her some hard blows, but there was a resilience about her that spoke of someone who didn't break easily. Whatever had driven her to these mountains in winter, desperate enough to risk death in the snow, must have been serious indeed. He'd seen enough in his years as a scout to know that sometimes the most dangerous predators walked on two legs. Was she running from someone? And if so, would they be foolish enough to try following her trail in this weather? Beck checked his rifle, more from habit than immediate concern. The storm would keep any pursuers at bay for now, and he knew every approach to his cabin. Years of solitude had honed his awareness of his surroundings to a razor's edge. If trouble came looking, it wouldn't find them unprepared. The fire crackled softly, and Mara stirred again in her sleep. This time her movement seemed more peaceful, less haunted. Beck pulled his chair closer to the stove, settling in for the long hours until dawn. Whatever morning might bring, for now his duty was clear: keep the fire burning, the shelter secure, and his unexpected guest safe through the night. The pale light of dawn crept through the cabin's frosted windows, casting weak shadows across the wooden floor. Beck had kept vigil through the night, tending the fire and checking on Mara as she drifted between consciousness and fevered sleep. Now, in the gray morning light, he carefully spooned warm broth between her cracked lips. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice stronger than the night before. Her eyes were clearer too, though exhaustion still lined her face. "Rest easy," Beck said softly. "Storm's passed, but you're not going anywhere just yet." He tucked the blankets more securely around her and reached for his coat. The woodbox was running low after the long night, and the morning air held the bitter bite of deep winter. Pulling on his heavy boots, Beck moved quietly to the door, not wanting to disturb Mara's rest. the moment he stepped outside, he froze. His breath caught in his throat at the sight before him. 20 children stood in a ragged line facing his cabin, their small bodies shivering in the pre-dawn cold. Some couldn't have been more than 6 or 7 years old, while the oldest looked to be in their early teens. All wore thin, city clothes completely unsuited for mountain weather. Their faces were pinched with cold and hunger, but their eyes were alert and wary as they watched him. Beck's mind reeled. These must be the little ones Mara had mentioned before collapsing. But how had they survived the brutal storm? A tall, gangly boy of about 13 stepped forward, his arm protectively around a much smaller girl. "Sir," he said, his teeth chattering, "we followed Miss Mara's trail. Took us 2 days in the storm, but we couldn't lose her. She taught us how to track real good." The boy's words carried pride, despite his obvious exhaustion. Beck noticed how the other children seemed to look to him, marking him as one of their leaders. "Come inside," Beck said quickly, his voice gruff with concern. "But in small groups. Cabin's not big. 5 at a time, oldest help the youngest." He held the door open as the first group hurried in. The tall boy organized the others, making sure the smallest children went first. Their movements showed the kind of discipline that spoke of long practice. These kids were used to following orders and looking out for each other. Inside, Mara's eyes flew open at the sound of small feet on the wooden floor. "Tommy," she called out weakly. "Sarah, is it really you?" "Miss Mara!" The children rushed to her side, but Beck noticed how careful they were not to jostle her. The tall boy, Tommy, kept the others from crowding too close. "We thought you might have died," a small girl with tangled brown hair whispered, tears streaming down her face. "But you taught us never to give up, so we kept following." Beck worked quickly, bringing in group after group of children while keeping the fire stoked. He pulled every blanket he owned from his storage chest, distributing them among the shivering youngsters. Some of the older ones immediately wrapped the blankets around the smaller children instead of themselves. As he moved around the cabin, Beck's mind raced. 20 extra mouths to feed, and winter far from over. He'd need to dip deep into his stored provisions, but what choice did he have? He set about preparing a meal from his winter stores. Beans and dried venison would have to do for now. The children watched his every move with hungry eyes, but none of them begged or reached for the food. Their discipline was remarkable and somewhat unsettling in one so young. Mara had managed to sit up, though she still leaned heavily against the wall. The children clustered around her like moths to a flame, seeking comfort in her presence despite their own exhaustion. "I thought I'd lost you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "When the storm separated us, I tried to circle back, but the snow was so thick." "You taught us too well, Miss Mara," Tommy said proudly. "We remembered everything, about tracking, about staying together, about watching the wind direction. Even when we couldn't see more than a few feet ahead, we knew we had to be getting closer to you." As Beck stirred the pot of beans, he listened to the bits and pieces of their story emerging. Mara had been some kind of protector to these orphans back in Denver, teaching them how to survive on the streets. She'd trained them in basic survival skills, tracking, silent movement, finding shelter, all things that had helped keep them alive during their desperate mountain journey. The cabin slowly warmed with the presence of so many bodies. Beck served out portions of food, making sure everyone got an equal share. The children ate carefully, many of them sharing their portions with the smaller ones despite their own obvious hunger. "Much obliged, sir," each one said as they received their bowl, manners that seemed at odds with their ragged appearance. Beck noticed how they all waited until everyone was served before eating, another sign of Mara's training. As evening approached, the children began to drift off to sleep, exhaustion finally overwhelming them. They curled up together on the cabin floor like a litter of puppies, sharing warmth and comfort. The older ones positioned themselves protectively around the younger children, a habit that spoke volumes about their life on the streets. Beck sat by the stove, watching the sleeping children and trying to make sense of his transformed world. Just yesterday, he'd been a solitary man in his solitary cabin, at peace with his quiet existence. Now his small home was filled to bursting with 20 young lives, each one carrying their own story of hardship and survival. Mara caught his eye from her place by the wall. "I'm sorry," she said softly, so as not to wake the sleeping children. "I never meant to bring trouble to your door." Beck shook his head slowly. "Ain't trouble," he said, though his voice held a note of uncertainty. "Just unexpected company." A ghost of a smile crossed Mara's tired face. "That's one way to put it." She looked around at the sleeping children, her expression softening. "They're good kids, Mr. McAllister. They've had hard lives, but they look out for each other. They'll work hard, won't be a burden." Beck nodded, understanding that she was worried about imposing on his hospitality. "We'll sort it all out tomorrow," he said quietly. "For now, just rest. You're all safe here." The fire crackled softly in the stove, its warm light playing across the sleeping faces of the children. Beck's quiet life had indeed vanished overnight, replaced by something far more complicated. But looking at these young survivors, he couldn't find it in himself to regret opening his door to their need. The last rays of sunlight faded from the windows as night settled over the mountains. Beck added more wood to the fire, knowing he'd need to make some serious plans tomorrow. Winter was long in the high country, and 21 extra mouths would strain his resources to the breaking point. But for tonight, his cabin had become a sanctuary for these lost children, and that would have to be enough. With the children fed and settled, Beck knew it was time for answers. He gestured for Mara to join him by the stove, where they could talk quietly without disturbing the exhausted young ones. Though still weak, she moved with more steadiness now, the warmth and food having restored some of her strength. "Reckon it's time you told me what brought you folks up here," Beck said, keeping his voice low. 20 children don't just wander into these mountains for no reason." Mara's hands tightened around her tin cup of coffee. The firelight caught the worry lines around her eyes, making her look older than she probably was. "No, they don't," she agreed. "We're running from someone dangerous." "Who?" Beck asked, though something in his gut told him he might not want to know the answer. "Major Jeb Harlan," Mara said, and Beck felt his heart turn to ice. "He leads a militia group down in the foothills. They've been collecting orphans, using them as scouts." Beck's hands clenched involuntarily. 20 years hadn't dulled the memory of that name, or the things he'd seen under Harlan's command. "Tell me everything," he said, his voice rougher than before. Mara took a deep breath. "It started small, a few children here and there, ones nobody would miss. Street kids, mostly. Harlan offered them food, shelter, protection, things they desperately needed. But once they were in his camp..." She paused, struggling with the words. "He turned them into his own private scout battalion. Unpaid, expendable, invisible, perfect for sneaking into places adults can't go, gathering information, mapping routes." "And if they refuse?" Beck asked, though he already knew the answer. "Punishment, starvation, or worse." Mara's voice cracked. "These 20, I helped them escape. We planned it for months, waiting for the right moment. But there are still 30 more children in his camp." From their bedrolls, several of the older children had stirred, listening. Tommy, the tall boy from earlier, sat up, "Tell him about the marches, Miss Mara," he said, his young face hardening with the memory. "Tell him what the Major makes us do." Other children began to sit up, adding their voices to the story. They described endless drills in all weather, forced marches through difficult terrain, punishment for any show of weakness. Children who couldn't keep up were denied food. Those who tried to run were made examples of. "He says we're his eyes and ears," a small girl named Sarah whispered. "Says we're serving a greater purpose, but mostly we're just hungry and scared." Beck listened, his old guilt churning inside him. He remembered Harlan's methods all too well, the rigid discipline, the casual cruelty, the way he justified everything as necessary for the greater good. It was Harlan's treatment of a Ute family that had finally driven Beck to leave the Scouts, a decision that still haunted him. Now here was Harlan again, still destroying lives, still corrupting everything he touched. "I'm sorry to bring this trouble to your door," Mara said, echoing her earlier apology. "But we had nowhere else to go. The settlements aren't safe. Harlan has too many connections. We needed somewhere remote, somewhere he wouldn't think to look right away." Beck stood and walked to his storage room, taking stock of his winter provisions. The neat rows of preserved food, dried meat, and flour sacks that had seemed plenty for one man now looked frighteningly inadequate for 22 people. They might stretch it for a while with careful rationing, but not indefinitely. When he returned to the main room, Mara was watching him anxiously. "We won't stay long," she promised. "Just until we can figure out somewhere else to go." Beck shook his head. "You'll stay as long as needed," he said firmly. "We'll manage the food somehow. Might be lean times ahead, but nobody's going hungry." Relief flooded Mara's face, but before she could respond, one of the children by the window called out in a frightened whisper, "Miss Mara! Mr. McAllister! There's lights on the ridge!" Beck moved quickly to the window. Sure enough, pinpoints of torchlight were moving along the distant ridgeline, barely visible through the falling snow. They were too far to make out details, but the systematic way they moved suggested searchers rather than travelers. "Get away from the windows," he instructed quietly. "No more fire in the stove. We don't want smoke giving us away." The children moved with practiced silence, gathering in the center of the room. Even the youngest ones seemed to understand the need for absolute quiet. Beck watched as Mara organized them efficiently, using hand signals he recognized from his scouting days. Stepping outside into the bitter cold, Beck studied the distant lights. They were moving methodically, sweeping the ridgeline in a search pattern. Harlan's training, without a doubt. The snow would slow them down, but it wouldn't stop them. Not if they were as determined as Beck remembered Harlan being. The wind carried no sounds of pursuit yet, but Beck knew better than to take that as reassurance. Harlan had always been patient in a hunt, willing to take his time to ensure his quarry had nowhere to run. Back inside, Beck found Mara waiting anxiously. "How close?" she whispered. "Far ridge for now," he answered. "But we'll need to be careful. No outside fires, no tracks in the snow we can't explain. Come morning, we'll need to bring in more firewood and water to last a few days. Make it look like regular winter stockpiling if anyone comes asking questions." Mara nodded, already thinking ahead. "The children know how to stay quiet, how to hide. It's not their first time." "Shouldn't have to be like that," Beck said, more to himself than to her. "Children shouldn't have to know how to hide." "No," Mara agreed softly. "They shouldn't." The torches on the ridge continued their slow dance through the darkness, a reminder that their sanctuary was more fragile than it appeared. Beck checked his rifle and pistol, making sure both were cleaned and loaded. He hoped he wouldn't need them, but Harlan had taught him long ago to hope for the best while preparing for the worst. The children had huddled together again, sharing warmth and comfort in the darkness. Their earlier chatter had given way to watchful silence, broken only by the occasional whisper or muffled cough. Beck was struck by how quickly they had adapted, how naturally they fell into survival mode. It spoke of hard lessons learned too young. "Try to get some sleep," he told them. "I'll keep watch tonight." "I can help," Tommy offered, but Beck shook his head. "You've done enough tracking through the storm. Rest now. There'll be plenty of work tomorrow." As the children settled down again, Beck positioned himself by the window where he could watch both the ridge and the approach to the cabin. The torches had disappeared behind the ridgeline, but he knew better than to relax his vigilance. Harlan would have men watching through the night, looking for any sign of his escaped charges. Mara moved to sit beside him, her shoulder barely brushing his. "You know him, don't you?" she asked quietly. "Harlan, I saw your face when I mentioned his name." Beck was silent for a long moment, watching the darkness outside. "Served under him," he finally admitted. 20 years ago, when I was scouting for the army. Saw things. Did things I'm not proud of. Should have spoken up sooner, should have stopped him before." He trailed off, the old guilt rising again. Mara seemed to understand what he couldn't say. She placed her hand briefly on his arm, a gesture of comfort that surprised him with its gentleness. "You can't change the past," she said softly. "But you're helping now. That counts for something." Beck nodded, though the weight of his old failure still sat heavy on his shoulders. Outside, the wind had picked up again, driving the snow in sideways sheets that would cover any tracks by morning. It was both blessing and curse. Their own tracks would be hidden, but so would any signs of approaching danger. The cabin creaked and settled in the cold, its familiar sounds now overlaid with the soft breathing of 20 sleeping children. Beck's quiet life had not just vanished. It had been completely upended, transformed into something both more dangerous and more vital than his solitary existence had been. He looked at Mara, who was still watching the darkness beyond the window. In the faint starlight filtering through the snow, he could see the determination in her profile, the fierce protectiveness that had driven her to risk everything for these children. Whatever came next, he knew he couldn't turn away from this fight. Not this time. The night deepened around them as they kept their vigil, watching for any sign that their pursuers had picked up their trail. The children slept on, unaware of the silent conversation passing between the two adults, who now stood between them and Harlan's cruel ambitions. For now, at least, they were safe in the mountain cabin, though tomorrow would bring its own challenges. Dawn crept over the mountains, painting the snow-covered valley in shades of pink and gold. Beck had maintained his vigil through the night, watching the ridgeline where the torches had vanished. Though the lights were gone, his unease remained. The cabin stirred to life as sunlight filtered through the frost-covered windows. Children began to wake, stretching and yawning on their makeshift beds of blankets. Mara was already up, quietly organizing the youngest ones and helping them fold their bedding. Beck moved to the wood stove, stoking the banked coals and adding fresh logs. The familiar routine of preparing breakfast helped steady his thoughts, but the weight of what he needed to share pressed heavily on him. As he worked, measuring out precious cornmeal and the last of his dried apples, he could feel Mara's questioning glances. The older children gathered around the rough-hewn table, while the younger ones sat cross-legged on the floor, clutching tin cups of hot tea. Steam rose from the pot of cornmeal mush cooking on the stove, filling the cabin with its warm, homey smell. "There's something you all need to know," Beck said finally, his voice low but carrying in the quiet room. "About Harlan. About why I understand the danger you're in." Tommy, one of the older boys, looked up sharply, You said you served with him. 20 years ago, Beck nodded, stirring the pot to keep the mush from sticking. I was an Army scout under his command. Young, eager to prove myself. Thought I was doing right by my country. He paused, the wooden spoon going still in his hand. The memories he'd tried so hard to bury rose like ghosts in the morning light. There was a Ute family living peaceful in a valley not far from here. Father, mother, 3 children. They had permission to be there, all the proper papers from the Indian agent. But Harlan... Beck's jaw tightened. Harlan decided they were spies for hostile bands. Nothing I said could convince him otherwise. Mara moved closer, her face grave. The children listened intently, even the youngest ones sensing the importance of his words. I should have done more, Beck continued, his voice rough with old pain. Should have found a way to warn them, to stop what was coming. But I was a coward, followed orders, watched while Harlan... He shook his head, unable to speak the horror of what had happened next. You were young, Mara said softly. Under his command. Being young doesn't excuse it. Beck met her eyes. I rode away afterward, left the army. Couldn't trust myself to wear the uniform after that. Been trying to live quiet ever since, trying to forget. But some things don't let themselves be forgotten. Tommy stood up straighter, his thin shoulders squaring. That's why you're helping us now. You know what he's capable of. Beck nodded. I know exactly what he's capable of, and I won't stand by this time, not while he's hunting children. The confession seemed to settle something in the room. The older children exchanged knowing looks, while the younger ones pressed closer to Mara, seeking her reassurance. They had all seen enough of life's harshness to recognize truth when they heard it. After breakfast, Beck gathered Tommy and another older boy, Daniel, for a patrol of the valley's perimeter. They needed to know how to spot danger before it reached the cabin. Watch how the snow lies, Beck instructed as they walked, pointing to the drifts. Fresh tracks sink deeper, have sharp edges. Old ones get rounded by wind and weather. The boys absorbed every word, their eyes keen as they studied the landscape. Beck showed them how to check wind direction by wetting a finger, how to listen for unusual silence that might indicate someone's presence. Most important thing is knowing your escape routes, he explained, indicating the various draws and gullies that led away from the cabin. Always have at least 2 ways out, preferably 3. Never let yourself get boxed in. Back at the cabin, Mara had organized the remaining children into work groups. Some gathered kindling under the trees closest to the cabin, careful not to leave obvious trails in the snow. Others helped her mend clothes torn during their flight, using Beck's small supply of thread and needles. The youngest ones carried buckets of snow inside to melt for washing and drinking water. Beck watched their industry with approval. These weren't helpless victims. They were survivors, already skilled in the art of making do with little. Still, his heart ached at how young they were to know such hardship. The short winter day was drawing to a close when Beck heard the familiar jingle of harness bells. He motioned everyone inside, keeping Tommy and Daniel with him as he watched a single horse and rider approach through the gathering dusk. "It's Jake," Beck said with relief, recognizing the old trapper's distinctive fox fur cap. But his relief turned to concern when he saw the urgency in Jake's usually unhurried manner. "Beck," Jake called out as soon as he was within speaking distance. "Glad I caught you before full dark." He dismounted stiffly, his breath clouding in the cold air. "Got news you need to hear." Beck ushered him inside, where Jake's eyes widened at the sight of so many children. He recovered quickly, though, and accepted the cup of hot coffee Mara offered. "Saw a militia band crossing Piedra Canyon yesterday," Jake said without preamble. 20, maybe 25 men. Well armed, moving like they know what they're about. Led by a big fellow carries himself like army. Harlan, Beck said grimly. Which direction were they heading? Straight for these mountains. Jake took a long swallow of coffee. Moving slow in the snow but steady, man in charge seemed mighty determined. The children had gone very quiet, pressing close to Mara. She met Beck's eyes across the room, her face set with determination despite her obvious worry. Much obliged for the warning, Jake, Beck said. The old trapper nodded, already moving toward the door. Best I get on then. Less I know about whatever's brewing, the better. But Beck, he paused, his weathered face serious. Watch yourself. Them fellows, they ain't the usual territory riffraff. They're hunting something specific. After Jake rode away, Beck checked every window, every door. The cabin was solid, built to withstand mountain winters, but it had never been meant as a fortress. He slid the heavy wooden bar across the door, knowing it was as much for the children's peace of mind as for actual security. In the growing darkness, he could feel the weight of 22 lives depending on him. The responsibility should have terrified him, should have sent him running back to his solitary existence. Instead, he felt a curious sense of purpose, as if everything since that long-ago tragedy had been leading to this moment. Beck moved to the window, gazing out at the snowy valley now painted in deep blues and purples by the approaching night. His lips moved in a silent prayer, not for himself, but for the children who slept behind him, for Mara who watched over them so fiercely, and for the strength to do better this time than he had 20 years ago. The cabin settled into its nighttime quiet, broken only by the soft breathing of sleeping children and the occasional pop from the dying fire. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the promise of more snow. Beck remained at his post, watching the darkness, ready to defend this unexpected family that fate had delivered to his door. The morning sun cast long shadows across the snow as Beck led Mara and the children away from the cabin. His boots crunched quietly through the fresh powder, while 22 pairs of smaller feet followed behind, creating a scattered trail that the wind would soon erase. Stay in the tree line, Beck instructed, his voice low and steady. Walk where the shadows are deepest. Tommy, Daniel, keep watching our back trail like I showed you. The two older boys nodded seriously, taking up positions at the rear of the group. Beck noticed how the younger children automatically arranged themselves between the older ones, a pattern they must have learned during their escape. His respect for their resilience grew with each passing hour. After 15 minutes of careful hiking, Beck held up his hand. The entire group froze instantly, demonstrating the kind of discipline that came from hard experience. He led them through a narrow gap between two snow-laden pines and into a natural hollow nestled against a rocky outcropping. Here, he said, gesturing to the protected space. The ridge blocks the wind. Trees are thick enough to hide firelight. Ground slopes away so water won't pool when snow melts. Mara surveyed the hollow with sharp eyes, noting the natural defensive advantages. Good sight lines too, she observed. We can see anyone approaching from below. Beck nodded approvingly. Exactly. And there's a narrow pass behind the rocks that leads to higher ground if we need it. The children spread out to explore the space, their movements careful and controlled. Even the youngest ones seemed to understand the need for stealth. Beck watched as they instinctively found natural hiding spots among the rocks and trees, their street-learned skills adapting quickly to the mountain environment. We'll need to move supplies, Mara said quietly. Food, blankets, anything essential. Already planned on it, Beck replied. We'll make multiple trips, space them out so we don't create an obvious trail. The children can carry small loads, make it look natural if anyone's watching, like we're just gathering firewood. They spent the next several hours implementing this plan. Beck divided the children into small groups, showing them how to wrap supplies in canvas to keep them dry. Each child carried what they could manage, following different paths to the hollow, never traveling in straight lines. On one trip, Beck overheard 7-year-old Sarah teaching little Michael how to walk without leaving clear footprints. "Step careful," she whispered, "like a deer does. Then the bad men can't follow." The simple wisdom in her words made Beck's heart ache. These children had learned too young about the need to hide, to survive. But that hard-won knowledge might help keep them alive now. By early afternoon, they had relocated enough supplies to sustain them for several days. Dried meat, beans, cornmeal, extra blankets, and basic tools. Beck had them carefully arrange everything under a natural overhang, where it would stay dry. "Now," he said, gathering everyone in a rough circle, "time to learn about snow shelters. Could save your life if you get separated from the group." He demonstrated how to pack snow into blocks, showing them the right consistency. Too loose, it falls apart. Too hard, you can't work it. Has to be just right, like building with nature's bricks. The children proved to be quick learners. Soon they were constructing small snow walls, helping each other pack and stack the blocks. Beck showed them how to angle the walls slightly inward, creating stable structures that could support more weight. "Make the entrance small," he instructed. "Helps keep warmth inside, and always build with your back to the wind." Mara worked alongside them, adding her own practical knowledge. "Remember how we used to build hiding spots in the warehouse district?" she asked the children. "Same principle, multiple exits, never trap yourself in a corner." As the afternoon progressed, Beck taught them the crucial skill of fire management. He showed them how to dig snow pits that would contain the flames, how to build reflector walls that directed heat while hiding the light. "Banking a fire is important," he explained, demonstrating with careful movements. "Cover the coals just right, and they'll stay hot for hours without sending up smoke. Smoke is a signal. Might as well wave a flag saying, 'Here we are.'" While Beck worked with one group on fire skills, Mara gathered the others to practice the silent communication system they'd developed in Denver. Her hands moved in quick, precise gestures that the children immediately understood. Beck watched with interest as they responded to her signals. Scatter, freeze, hide, all clear. Each motion had a specific meaning, and the children executed them flawlessly. It was a language born of necessity, developed in dark alleys and abandoned buildings, but it would serve them well in these mountains too. The short winter day was fading when Beck finally called a halt to the training. They needed to return to the cabin before dark. The children had worked hard, their faces tired but proud of what they'd accomplished. Back at the cabin, Beck and Mara prepared a simple but filling supper of beans and cornbread. The children ate quietly, their usual chatter subdued by the day's serious work. One by one they began drifting off to sleep, curling up in their blankets like a litter of puppies seeking warmth from each other. When the last small head had nodded off, Mara caught Beck's eye and tilted her head toward the door. He understood her need to talk privately and followed her outside. The night was clear and cold, stars sharp as icicles in the black sky, their breath frosted in the air as they stood in the shadow of the cabin. For a long moment, neither spoke, both watching the silent mountains. Finally, Mara's voice came, barely above a whisper. "I'm scared, Beck." Her admission seemed to cost her something. "Not for myself. For them. I've already lost so many children over the years, some to sickness, some to the streets, some just disappeared." She wrapped her arms around herself, less from cold than from the weight of memory. "I can't lose these ones. Not to Harlan. Not after everything they've survived." Beck turned to face her, seeing the fierce, protective love that drove her. It matched something growing in his own heart, a determination that these children would not become yet another tragedy he failed to prevent. "You won't lose them," he said, his voice carrying absolute conviction. "We won't lose them. I promise you that, Mara." She studied his face in the starlight, seeming to read the truth of his commitment there. After a moment, she nodded, accepting his promise as a bond between them. They returned inside, where the cabin's warmth wrapped around them like a blanket. The children were all deeply asleep now, their bodies tangled together in unconscious trust. Some still held hints of tension even in sleep, hands clutching blankets or each other, but their faces were peaceful. Beck added another log to the stove, adjusting it carefully to minimize smoke. The soft red glow illuminated the sleeping children, casting gentle shadows on their young faces. In that moment, looking at these small survivors who had already endured so much, he knew with absolute certainty that he would die before letting any harm come to them. He settled into his chair by the stove, rifle across his knees, preparing for another night of watchful guardianship. Across the room, Mara arranged her blanket near the youngest children, who instinctively shifted closer to her warmth. The cabin creaked softly in the cold, a sound that had once represented Beck's solitude, but now spoke of shelter and protection for this unexpected family. Morning light filtered through the frost-covered windows as Beck stirred a pot of cornmeal mush over the stove. The children were already awake, their excitement palpable despite the early hour. They had seen enough of Beck's skills yesterday to be eager for more training. "Eat up," Mara encouraged, helping distribute the simple breakfast. "You'll need your strength today." Beck watched them eat, noting how even the youngest showed remarkable patience in waiting their turn. Their time on Denver's streets had taught them discipline, if nothing else. When the last spoon had been cleaned and put away, he gathered them near the door. "Today, we learned to read the mountain," he said, his voice steady and confident. "The snow, the trails, the ridges, they all tell stories if you know how to listen." 20 pairs of eyes fixed on him with intense focus. These children understood that their lives might depend on what they learned here. "First lesson, tracking," Beck continued. "We'll start with rabbit trails. They're common enough that you'll have plenty to practice with." He led them outside, the morning air crisp and clean. Fresh snow had fallen overnight, providing perfect conditions for tracking practice. Beck knelt beside a set of distinctive prints in the snow, motioning the children to gather round. "See how the tracks form a pattern?" He traced the air above the prints. 2 larger marks, then 2 smaller ones behind. "That's how rabbits move. Front paws land first, back paws follow." The children crowded closer, their breath creating small clouds in the cold air. 10-year-old Tommy pointed to where the tracks disappeared beneath a low-hanging pine branch. "Where's he gone?" "That's part of what you need to learn," Beck replied. "Animals don't move randomly. They follow paths that offer food and safety." He gestured to the surrounding area. "Look for signs, bark stripped from young trees, droppings, matted grass under the snow." He divided them into small groups, each led by one of the older children. Mara moved between the groups, her street wisdom complementing Beck's mountain knowledge. "Remember how we used to track the vegetable wagon through the market?" she reminded them. "Same principle. Look for signs, think about where your quarry is headed." The children took to tracking with natural enthusiasm. Soon they were calling out discoveries to each other. A rabbit's feeding place beneath a berry bush, a spot where one had burrowed under the snow. As the morning wore on, Beck moved on to teaching them about snow safety. He showed them how to test snow depth with a stick, how to recognize areas where drifts might hide dangerous drops or loose rocks. "The mountain can be treacherous," he warned. "Snow that looks solid might be hiding hollow spaces underneath. Watch for changes in color or texture. Darker patches often mean thinner ice. He demonstrated how to walk safely across snow-covered slopes, placing each foot carefully and testing the ground before shifting weight. The children mimicked his movements, turning it into a sort of game while still absorbing the serious lessons. Like crossing the railroad tracks, 13-year-old Sarah observed. Got to test each tie before you step. Beck nodded, impressed by how quickly they connected their street experiences to mountain survival. These children were natural adapters, their hard lives having taught them to learn fast or perish. After a brief rest and some dried meat for lunch, Beck led them to a nearby ridge for climbing practice. Here, the lessons became more challenging and more crucial. Rocks can be as dangerous as they are useful, he explained. A falling stone can give away your position or hurt someone below. Always test your handholds and footholds before trusting them. He showed them how to climb without dislodging rocks, how to distribute their weight evenly, and move with careful deliberation. The older boys proved especially adept at this, their wiry strength and natural agility serving them well. For defensive training, Beck brought out several smooth, sturdy staffs he had cut the previous evening, along with some leather slings he had crafted. "These are your tools," he said, distributing them among the older children. "They don't need loading like a gun. They don't make noise, and most importantly, they can defend without killing." He spent the afternoon teaching basic staff techniques, blocking, striking, using, the staff for balance while moving through difficult terrain. The slings required more precise instruction, but several of the older boys showed promising accuracy after just a few hours of practice. Mara worked with the younger children, organizing them into teams and teaching them to move as coordinated units. She showed them how to use hand signals to communicate silently, how to stay in the shadows even in broad daylight, and how to help the smallest members of their group keep up without leaving anyone vulnerable. "Remember the alley rules," she said firmly. "No one gets left behind. The group protects its own." Throughout the day, Beck watched a remarkable transformation take place. The frightened, exhausted children who had appeared at his door just days ago were becoming something else, a coordinated, capable unit. They moved with growing confidence, their natural resilience combining with their new skills to create something powerful. As the afternoon light began to fade, Beck called a halt to the training. But the children weren't finished surprising him. "We made something," Tommy announced proudly. "Want to see?" Beck followed the children to a spot just behind the cabin. There, cleverly hidden among the trees, they had constructed a lookout post using branches and pine boughs. It was crude but effective, offering a clear view of the valley while remaining nearly invisible from below. "We remembered how you said watching approaches was important," Sarah explained. "So we built this while we were resting. The little ones helped gather branches." Beck examined their work, genuinely impressed by their initiative and ingenuity. The structure was remarkably stable, and they had even included a small platform where a watcher could sit comfortably. "This is excellent work," he said, his praise making the children beam with pride. "You've chosen the perfect spot. Good visibility but well concealed." Mara caught his eye, sharing a look of quiet amazement at their accomplishment. These children were proving to be not just survivors, but innovators. Back in the cabin, they shared a hearty supper of beans and the last of the cornbread. Despite their exhaustion, the children chattered excitedly about the day's training, each eager to share what they had learned. "Can we practice more with the slings tomorrow?" Tommy asked through a mouthful of beans. "I want to learn more about tracking," little Michael piped up. "I found 3 different rabbit trails today." Beck couldn't help but smile at their enthusiasm. "There's plenty more to learn," he assured them. "But for now you need rest. Tomorrow will be another full day." As lamplight filled the cabin with a warm glow, the children began settling down for the night. Their faces showed healthy exhaustion, not the desperate fatigue of their arrival, but the satisfied weariness that comes from good, purposeful work. Mara moved among them, adjusting blankets and soothing the youngest ones to sleep. The older children automatically positioned themselves around the younger ones, their protective instincts already well developed. Beck watched them from his post by the stove, feeling a profound sense of hope. These children had survived unimaginable hardships, yet here they were, still able to learn, to adapt, to grow stronger. They were no longer just frightened runaways. They were becoming a cohesive force, a family bound by something stronger than blood. The lamp's glow softened the shadows in the cabin, and one by one, the children drifted off to sleep. Their day of training had exhausted them, but their faces showed peace rather than fear. Tomorrow would bring more lessons, more challenges. But for now, they rested secure in the knowledge that they were growing stronger with each passing day. Morning light streamed through the cabin's frost-edged windows, bringing with it the sounds of children stirring. Beck sat at his workbench, carefully examining the snowshoe he was mending. A broken crosspiece needed replacing, and the sinew bindings had grown loose with use. "I get to feed the chickens today," 7-year-old Lucy announced, her voice carrying across the cabin. "No fair you did it yesterday," Michael protested, scrambling up from his bedroll. Beck glanced up from his work, watching as Mara smoothly intervened. "There's plenty of work for everyone," she said, her tone gentle but firm. "Michael, you can help gather eggs. Lucy, show him how to check the nests without frightening the hens." The children's squabble dissolved into giggles as they pulled on their boots and warm clothing. Beck couldn't help but smile. These small disputes were healthy signs, showing the children felt secure enough to act like children again. More young voices joined the morning chorus as the rest of the group woke. Some headed outside to fetch water and firewood, while others helped Mara prepare breakfast. The cabin hummed with activity, so different from the solitary mornings Beck had known for so many years. "Sarah, would you show the little ones how to fold their blankets properly?" Mara asked, stirring a pot of porridge. The 13-year-old nodded, gathering the younger children around her with natural authority. Tommy appeared at Beck's workbench, watching intently as he worked on the snowshoe. "Could you teach me to fix those?" he asked quietly. "Reckon I could," Beck replied, moving aside to make room. "Pull up that stool. First thing to know is how to choose the right wood for repairs." The morning unfolded in a comfortable rhythm of chores and lessons. Beck showed Tommy the basics of snowshoe repair while keeping an eye on the older boys chopping kindling outside. Mara moved through the cabin like a gentle breeze, directing activities and settling minor disputes with practiced ease. As the porridge finished cooking, Mara gathered the children in a circle near the stove. "Before we eat," she said, "I want to teach you something special." She waited until all 20 faces turned toward her, even the usually fidgety ones growing still. "Back in Denver, I knew a kind woman who taught me this morning prayer," Mara continued. "It helped me remember that each day is a gift, no matter how hard things might be." She folded her hands and bowed her head slightly. "Please repeat after me. For this new morning with its light." The children's voices joined hers, some hesitant at first, then growing stronger. "For rest and shelter of the night, for health and food, for love and friends, for everything thy goodness sends, we thank thee, Lord." Beck watched from his workbench, deeply moved by the simple ceremony. He saw how it centered the children, giving them a moment of peace and gratitude before the day began in earnest. After breakfast, the morning passed quickly with more chores and basic lessons. Mara taught the younger children their letters using sticks to write in the snow, while Beck continued training the older ones in survival skills. The cabin rang with occasional laughter, and the steady murmur of voices. As lunch approached, Beck noticed dark clouds building over the western peaks. His experienced eye recognized the signs of an approaching storm. This would provide the perfect opportunity for a practical lesson. Over bowls of bean soup and the last of yesterday's cornbread, Beck announced, "We've got about an hour before that storm hits. Your challenge is to work together to build emergency shelters that will keep you dry." The children's eyes lit up at the prospect of a team challenge. They quickly organized themselves into groups, just as they had practiced the day before. Beck watched with approval as the older children naturally took charge of helping the younger ones. "Remember what we learned about snow depth and safe locations," he called out as they scattered to gather materials. "Work fast but smart." The next hour was a flurry of focused activity. Beck moved between the groups, offering advice where needed but mostly observing their progress. He felt a familiar warmth in his chest, remembering similar exercises during his army scouting days. Before Harlan, before everything went wrong. This was what camaraderie should be. People working together, protecting each other, building something worthwhile. The children proved remarkably resourceful. One team created a sturdy lean-to using fallen branches and pine boughs. Another group dug into a snowbank to create a snow cave, just as Beck had taught them. The smallest children gathered armfuls of dry grass for bedding, their serious faces showing complete dedication to their task. 10 minutes, Mara called out, watching the approaching storm clouds. The warning spurred the children to even greater effort. Just as the first snowflakes began to fall, Beck inspected their work. Each shelter showed creativity and solid construction. More importantly, the children had worked together seamlessly, supporting and encouraging each other without prompting. "Well done," he announced, pride evident in his voice. "These will keep you dry in any storm. Now let's get back inside before this one hits properly." They hurried back to the cabin as the snow began falling in earnest. The wind picked up, rattling the windows, but inside all was warm and secure. The children chattered excitedly about their shelters, each group proud of their accomplishment. As evening approached, the cabin took on a cozy atmosphere, despite the storm howling outside. Beck had shown some of the older children how to make simple biscuits, and now they carefully toasted them over the fire, faces glowing with concentration. Mara sat in the rocking chair, mending torn sleeves and pants with quick, sure stitches. Several of the younger children gathered around her feet, listening as she told them stories about clever orphans who outsmarted cruel merchants in Denver's marketplace. Beck settled into his usual spot by the stove, ostensibly checking his traps for repairs, but really just taking in the scene before him. The cabin had never felt so alive, so full of purpose. These children, who had arrived at his door starving and terrified just days ago, were becoming something remarkable, a family. He watched as the older children helped serve the hot biscuits to the younger ones, making sure everyone got their fair share. They had learned to look out for each other long before reaching his cabin, but now that protective instinct was growing stronger, more confident. The evening passed peacefully. Children played quiet games with pebbles and string, practiced their letters in the ash near the stove, or simply curled up in corners with borrowed books. Mara's gentle voice wove through it all, answering questions, offering praise, settling minor disputes. As night deepened and the children began preparing for bed, Beck heard something that made his heart catch. A small voice, heavy with sleep, murmured, "Good night, Uncle Beck." He turned to find little Lucy looking up at him with complete trust in her eyes. Before he could respond, she had already snuggled down into her blankets, confident in her place in this makeshift family. Beck sat very still, letting the warmth of that moment settle in his chest. He caught Mara's eye across the room and saw his own emotion reflected there, a mix of wonder and fierce protectiveness. The cabin gradually grew quiet as the children drifted off to sleep. The fire crackled softly, and the storm continued its muffled roar outside. Beck made his usual rounds, checking the door and windows, adding wood to the stove, making sure everyone had enough blankets. Finally, he returned to his chair by the stove. The scene before him was one of perfect peace. 20 children sleeping safely, Mara dozing in the rocking chair, her mending still in her lap. The lamplight cast a gentle glow over it all, making the cabin feel like a sanctuary. Beck allowed himself to fully feel the contentment of this moment, knowing somewhere in his heart that such peace was precious and rare. These children had brought something back to life in him that he thought had died long ago. The ability to care, to protect, to belong. The lamp burned low as the night deepened, and Beck kept his quiet vigil, watching over his newfound family as they slept. The morning dawned gray and heavy, with thick clouds pressing down on the mountains like a wool blanket. Beck stirred the fire in the cabin stove, while the children began their usual morning routines. The familiar sounds of quiet chatter and shuffling feet filled the small space, as Mara helped distribute bowls for breakfast. 6-year-old Willow sat quietly in her corner, her usual bright smile absent. Beck had noticed she seemed subdued the night before, but had hoped a good night's rest would help. Now, in the dim morning light, he could see her cheeks were flushed despite her paleness. "Come get your porridge, little one," Mara called to her gently. Willow stood shakily, took 2 steps toward the group, then began coughing. The sound was deep and harsh, nothing like a normal child's cough. Before anyone could reach her, her legs gave out and she crumpled to the floor. "Willow!" Mara rushed to the child's side, gathering her into her arms. The other children crowded around, their faces etched with worry. Beck knelt beside them, placing a weathered hand on Willow's forehead. "She's burning up," he muttered, meeting Mara's concerned gaze. Mara's fingers moved expertly over Willow's throat and chest, checking for symptoms she'd learned to recognize during her years caring for street children. Her expression grew more troubled with each passing moment. "This isn't just a cold," she said quietly, so the other children wouldn't hear. "I've seen mountain fever take hold like this before, from exposure during the storm, without proper medicine." She didn't finish the sentence. Beck helped move Willow to his own bed, the most comfortable spot in the cabin. The little girl's breathing was labored, and her skin felt hot as campfire stones. Mara wet a cloth with cool water and placed it on her forehead, but they both knew it wasn't enough. Outside, the wind was picking up again, driving heavy snowflakes against the windows. Beck stood at the cabin door, studying the threatening sky. He knew of only one place within reach that might have the medicine they needed: the Ute settlement where his old friend Elias Whitehawk lived, about half a day's ride to the south. Through the morning, Willow's condition deteriorated rapidly. Her cough grew worse, and the fever showed no signs of breaking despite Mara's careful attention. The other children huddled together, speaking in whispers, their eyes constantly drawn to the quiet form on Beck's bed. By midday, Beck could wait no longer. He pulled Mara aside while the children were eating their simple lunch of dried meat and hard biscuits. "I have to try," he said firmly. "Elias Whitehawk knows medicines we don't. He might be able to help." Mara glanced at the windows, where the storm was building in intensity. "It's dangerous out there, Beck. And what about Harlan's men?" "We don't have a choice." Beck's voice was quiet but determined. "I've seen mountain fever before. Without help." He looked over at Willow's still form. Mara nodded, understanding the unspoken truth. "I'll keep them safe here," she promised. "Just come back to us." Beck gathered his warmest clothes and some basic supplies. The children watched silently as he pulled on his heavy coat and checked his gear one final time. Little Lucy tugged at his sleeve before he could leave. "Is Willow going to be all right?" she asked, her voice trembling. Beck knelt down to her level. "That's why I'm going to see my friend. He knows special medicine that can help her get better." He tried to sound more confident than he felt. Outside, the wind cut through his layers like icy knives. Beck led his horse from the stable, speaking soft words of encouragement to the nervous animal. The storm was building faster than he'd expected, the sky a solid mass of threatening gray. He mounted up, taking one last look at the cabin. Through the window he could see Mara's face, surrounded by the children. They had already become his family, and leaving them alone felt like tearing something inside his chest. But Willow's labored breathing echoed in his mind, driving him forward. The first few hours of riding were brutal. The wind grew stronger with each passing mile, driving snow and ice into his face, despite the protection of his collar and hat. His horse struggled through deepening drifts, and visibility shortened to mere yards ahead. Beck relied on his years of experience in these mountains, reading the terrain through the storm. He knew these trails like the lines on his own hands, but in weather like this, even the most familiar paths could become treacherous. Every hour, he stopped briefly to check his direction and give his horse a short rest. By late afternoon, the storm had become a howling beast. Snow whirled around him in white sheets, and the wind screamed through the trees like a living thing. His fingers had gone numb despite his thick gloves, and ice had formed on his beard and eyelashes. Still, he pressed on. Each time he considered turning back, he thought of Willow's feverish face and Mara's worried eyes. He thought of 20 children who had already lost so much, waiting to see if their little sister would survive the night. The short winter day was fading into an early dusk when his horse stumbled badly, nearly sending him over its head. Beck dismounted and led the exhausted animal on foot, breaking trail through snow that reached past his knees. The cold had worked its way into his bones, making every step an effort of will. Darkness fell completely, but Beck kept moving. He was nearly frozen, his thoughts becoming sluggish when he finally saw a faint glow through the trees. The Ute settlement lay in a protected valley, its scattered dwellings barely visible through the storm. Beck's legs were shaking with exhaustion as he approached the nearest lodge. "Elias!" he called out, his voice hoarse from the cold. "Elias Whitehawk!" For a moment there was no response, except the howling wind. Then a figure emerged from one of the lodges, holding a lantern high. The light revealed the dignified face of Elias Whitehawk, his long gray hair whipping in the wind. "Beck McAllister," Elias said, his deep voice carrying even through the storm. "What brings you out in weather that even the wolves fear?" Beck stumbled forward, his fingers clumsy as he grasped Elias's arm in greeting. "I need your help, old friend. A child. Mountain fever. She's dying." Elias studied Beck's face for a long moment, reading the desperation there. Then he nodded once and turned toward his lodge. "Come. You must warm yourself first. Then we will talk." "There's no time," Beck protested, but Elias's grip on his arm was firm. "You can help no one if you freeze to death," the healer said simply. 10 minutes by the fire, then we will see what can be done." Inside the lodge, the warmth hit Beck like a physical force. He hadn't realized how close to freezing he truly was until feeling began returning to his limbs in painful waves. Elias wrapped a blanket around his shoulders and pressed a cup of hot tea into his hands. As feeling returned, Beck quickly explained about Willow, the other children, and their situation. He left out mention of Harlan for now. That was a complexity that could wait. Elias listened without interruption, his dark eyes thoughtful. When Beck finished, Elias rose and began gathering items from various pouches and containers around the lodge. "The fever you describe, we know it well," he said as he worked. "It takes many during the winter months, especially the young and old. But we have medicines that can help, if given in time." Hope sparked in Beck's chest as he watched Elias prepare a bundle of herbs and powders. The healer added detailed instructions for Mara on how to prepare and administer the medicine. "You cannot return tonight," Elias said firmly, looking out at the darkness. "The storm is too strong." "I have to," Beck replied, already standing despite his exhaustion. 20 children are depending on me and Willow. Every hour counts." Elias studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "You have changed, Beck McAllister. There is something in your eyes now that was missing before. Something that was stolen in the shadow of war." Beck thought of the children waiting in his cabin, of Mara's quiet strength, of little Willow fighting for her life. "Maybe I found something I thought I'd lost," he said quietly. Elias handed him the precious bundle of medicine, wrapped carefully in waterproof hide. "May the spirits guide you home safely, my friend. When the storm passes, we will speak more of these changes." Beck tucked the medicine securely inside his coat, closest to his body where it would stay dry. His clothes were still damp, and his muscles protested as he moved, but the warmth of Elias's fire had renewed his strength enough to continue. Outside, the storm raged on, but Beck felt a fierce determination as he mounted his now rested horse. He had what he needed to save Willow. Now he just had to make it back through the night. The wind howled around him as he turned north, leaning into the storm, every step taking him closer to home and the family waiting there. Inside Elias's lodge, the fire cast dancing shadows on the walls. Beck sat close to the flames, his frozen clothes steaming as warmth slowly returned to his limbs. Elias moved with practiced efficiency, hanging herbs to dry and preparing a strong tea that smelled of pine and sage. "Now," Elias said, pressing a warm cup into Beck's hands, "tell me everything. Not just about the sick child, but why you ride through killing weather with such desperation in your eyes." Beck wrapped his fingers around the earthen cup, letting its warmth seep into his bones. The story spilled out of him like spring melt. 20 children huddled in his cabin, Mara's brave escape through the storm, and the shadow of Harlan's militia moving ever closer to their sanctuary. "How many children did you say?" Elias asked, his dark eyes sharp with concern. 20, Beck replied. "Most no older than 12 summers. The youngest, Willow, she's the one burning with fever now." He paused, drawing a deep breath. "And there are 30 more still in Harlan's grip." Elias's face grew grave. "Jeb Harlan. That name carries dark memories." "Yes." Beck's voice turned rough with old pain. "And I need to tell you something I should have said years ago." He set down his cup, hands trembling slightly. "That day, with the Ute family near Thunder Basin, I was there. I saw what Harlan did." The fire crackled in the silence that followed. Elias's expression remained unchanged, but his eyes held ancient sadness. "I didn't stop him," Beck continued, the words bitter as medicine. "I watched him murder that family. Parents, grandparents, children, all because they wouldn't guide his troops through the pass. I stood there, following orders like a coward, while he—" His voice broke. Elias raised his hand, the gesture gentle but firm. "I have known this truth since the day it happened, Beck McAllister. The spirits of our people see all things. What matters is that the memory haunts you still. It shows your heart never hardened to such cruelty." "But I did nothing," Beck whispered. "And that shame changed you," Elias observed. "It drove you to these mountains, away from men's company. Now the Creator has sent you 20 children to protect. Perhaps this is your chance to make different choices." Beck looked up, meeting the healer's steady gaze. "I won't fail them like I failed before." "Then listen carefully," Elias said, his voice taking on new urgency. "Harlan has grown worse over the years. The war broke something in him, but instead of seeking healing, he fed the darkness. We hear stories from other bands. He takes what he wants, kills those who resist, and twists young minds to serve his purpose." Moving to a leather pouch hanging near the fire, Elias began selecting dried herbs and powders. "The medicine for the child is simple enough. Steep these herbs in hot water. Give her small sips every hour. The fever should break by tomorrow night." He wrapped the medicines carefully in a piece of waterproof hide, then reached for a small leather bag hanging around his neck. From it, he withdrew a circular charm made of intricately woven horsehair and decorated with tiny beads. "This is something more," Elias explained, holding it up so the firelight caught the beads. "Our people use it to guide lost children home in storms or darkness. It carries prayers for protection and clear paths." He pressed it into Beck's hand. "The children you shelter will need every blessing available." Beck stared at the charm, deeply moved by the gift's significance. "I don't deserve your help after what happened." "The past is like a river," Elias said softly. "We cannot change its course behind us, only choose how we navigate the waters ahead." He gripped Beck's shoulder. "Rest now, even if briefly. You must leave before dawn to stay ahead of the storm's next wave." Beck wanted to argue, thinking of Willow's fever, but exhaustion dragged at his limbs. He nodded, settling back against a rolled blanket. Sleep claimed him almost instantly, his dreams filled with swirling snow and children's voices calling through the wind. Elias woke him after what felt like moments, but must have been several hours. Outside, the sky was still dark, but the storm had quieted to gentle snowfall. Beck's clothes were dry, and a small breakfast of cornmeal and dried meat waited by the fire. "Eat quickly," Elias advised, already helping Beck gather his gear. "The storm's eye is passing. You must ride through this calm while it lasts." Beck pulled on his coat and checked that the medicine bundle was secure inside. The protective charm he tucked carefully into his shirt pocket, close to his heart. "Thank you," he said simply, knowing no words could fully express his gratitude. Elias nodded, then added, "When spring comes, bring the children here. They will need more eyes watching over them, and our people remember what it means to protect the innocent from men like Harlan." Beck mounted his horse, which had been well fed and rested in Elias's stable. The pre-dawn air was crisp but clear, and his mount seemed eager to move. With a final wave to his friend, Beck turned north and urged his horse into a steady trot. The storm's brief respite proved to be a blessing. As morning light gradually filled the sky, Beck found himself riding under clearing conditions. The fresh snow made navigation easier. He could spot familiar landmarks that were usually hidden by trees, allowing him to choose the most direct route home. He pushed hard through the morning hours, stopping only briefly to rest his horse and check his bearings. The medicine bundle pressed against his chest reminded him of his urgent mission with every hoofbeat. Willow's fever-bright eyes and Mara's worried face drove him forward, even when his muscles ached from cold and fatigue. The sun had passed its peak when Beck finally approached the familiar ridgeline, marking the edge of his valley. He felt relief surge through him, just a little further now. But as he crested the ridge, that relief turned to ice in his veins. Smoke rose from the direction of his cabin. Thick, dark smoke that couldn't possibly come from his small stove. Too much smoke. Wrong smoke. Beck's heart began pounding against his ribs. He urged his tired horse forward, no longer worried about stealth or caution. The animal seemed to sense his urgency, picking up speed despite its exhaustion. Through the trees, Beck could see more smoke rising, staining the pristine white of new snow with its ominous darkness. His mind raced with possibilities, each worse than the last. Had Harlan found them already? Were the children safe? Was Mara? He pressed on, the protective charm seeming to burn against his chest as he rode toward whatever waited in the valley below. Beck's horse thundered into the clearing, sending clouds of disturbed snow into the crisp mountain air. He pulled up short, his heart stopping at the sight before him. Where their carefully prepared secondary camp had stood, only smoking ruins remained. The neat row of snow shelters lay trampled and scattered, their branch frames splintered and torn. Dark smoke still curled up from the remains of their supply cache, the smell of burned leather and fabric heavy in the air. He dismounted quickly, scanning the ground with practiced eyes. The snow told a clear story, one that made his chest tighten with fear and anger. Dozens of boot prints crossed and recrossed the clearing, along with the smaller tracks of running children. Near the edge of the camp, he found signs of a desperate struggle, churned snow, a dropped mitten, and worst of all, drops of blood staining the white ground red. "No," he whispered, following the chaotic trail. The tracks showed the children had split up, just as they'd practiced. Most fled east into the deeper timber with Mara, but 3 sets of boy-sized prints ended in a tangle of adult boots before being dragged away west, toward where he'd seen militia torches days before. Beck recognized the boot sizes. They'd taken Thomas, Samuel, and James, the 3 oldest boys who'd been learning to use slings and staffs. His jaw clenched as he pictured their brave faces. They must have tried to protect the younger ones, buying time for Mara to lead the rest to safety. He quickly gathered what supplies remained salvageable, securing them to his horse. Then he set off following the eastern tracks, moving as fast as he dared while still reading the signs. Mara had done well, leading them in a winding path that would be hard to follow. The children's tracks showed they'd remembered their training, stepping in each other's footprints to minimize their trail. The afternoon light was starting to fade when Beck finally heard it, the faintest whisper of movement from a narrow ravine ahead. He approached cautiously, whistling the 4-note signal they'd established. A moment later, Mara's answering whistle floated back. Beck picked his way down into the ravine. The steep walls offered good protection from wind and eyes, but also left them with only one way out. He found them huddled together about 50 yards in, where the ravine widened slightly. 17 faces turned toward him, tired, frightened, but alive. "Beck!" Mara's voice was hoarse with relief. She hurried forward, helping him with his pack. In the dim light, he could see fresh scratches on her face and tears in her coat. "Thank God you're back. They found us just before midday, scouts on horseback. We tried to run, but—" Her voice caught. "I saw the tracks," Beck said quietly. "Tell me what happened." Mara's eyes filled with tears. "Thomas and the older boys. They said they'd hold them off while I got the little ones away. I tried to stop them, Beck. I tried to go back for them, but there were too many militia. They had guns." She pressed her hands to her face. I couldn't save them." Beck placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You did exactly right," he said firmly. "You protected the ones you could." He looked past her to where the youngest children huddled together. "Willow?" "Here," came a weak voice. The little girl was wrapped in several blankets, her face flushed with fever. Beck knelt beside her, pulling out the medicine bundle Elias had prepared. "I've got something that will help," he told her softly, already working to steep the herbs in hot water from his canteen. "A friend made it special for you." While the medicine brewed, Beck listened as Mara filled in more details. The militia scouts had appeared suddenly from the north, 6 men on horseback. They'd tried to surround the camp, but the children's practiced evacuation plan had worked mostly as intended. The older boys had grabbed their staffs and slings, launching a brief but fierce resistance that let the others slip away. "James got one of them with his sling," Mara said, a note of fierce pride mixing with her grief. "Hit him right in the face, but then they—" She trailed off, unable to finish. Beck handed the first cup of medicine to Willow, helping her take small sips. Already he could feel the protective charm from Elias warming against his chest, as if responding to the child's need. "The boys are alive," he said with quiet certainty. "Harlan will want to question them, and they're strong, stronger than he knows." The other children pressed closer as darkness began to fill the ravine. Beck organized them efficiently, setting up what shelter they could manage with their limited supplies. The ravine walls would block the worst of the wind, and shared body heat would help keep them warm. Still, it would be a long, cold night. "What do we do now?" one of the older girls asked, as Beck distributed the last of their blankets. "We rest tonight," he answered, making sure his voice carried confidence he didn't entirely feel. "Tomorrow we start planning how to get our boys back." The children eventually settled into uneasy sleep, curled together like wolf pups in a den. Mara tended to Willow, giving her medicine at the intervals Elias had specified. The little girl's fever seemed to be easing already, her breathing growing less labored. Beck took the first watch, positioning himself where he could see both up and down the ravine. The wind swept through the canyon with a lonely howl, carrying the faint scent of smoke from their ruined camp. In the distance, he could just make out the dark smudge still rising against the stars. His hand strayed to the protective charm as he kept his vigil. The raid had been a harsh blow, but they were not beaten. 17 children still lived free, and 3 brave boys waited for rescue. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, his duty was clear. Keep watch, keep them warm, keep them safe through the night. The cold wind moaned between the ravine walls, carrying whispers of snow. Beck pulled his coat tighter, eyes steady on the darkness, mind already turning over plans for what must come next. Dawn crept over the mountains with fingers of pale gold light. Frost coated every branch and twig, making the forest glitter like it was strung with tiny diamonds. Beck and Mara moved silently through this sparkling wonderland, checking the perimeter around their hidden ravine camp. They paused at a high point overlooking the valley below, their breath forming small clouds in the crisp morning air. Beck knelt to examine some tracks in the thin layer of fresh snow, boot prints from a militia patrol that had passed through yesterday afternoon. "They're searching in a grid pattern," he said quietly, pointing out how the tracks moved in methodical lines. "But they're not being as thorough as they could be. They don't know these mountains like I do." Mara nodded, pulling her worn coat tighter against the morning chill. "How close do you think their main camp is?" "Based on the smoke we saw yesterday, I'd guess about 4 miles northwest, near Crystal Creek." Beck straightened up, his expression grave. "The boys will be there, and if we're going to have any chance of getting them out, I need to get closer. Learn the layout, count their numbers, find out how they're being held." "That's dangerous," Mara said, though her tone suggested she knew it was necessary. "If they catch you." "They won't." Beck's voice held quiet confidence. I spent years scouting these mountains. I know how to move without being seen. He turned to face her fully. Can you keep the children safe while I'm gone? It shouldn't take more than a few hours. Mara's chin lifted slightly. Of course. We'll stay quiet and hidden. The little ones know how important it is now. They made their way back to the ravine, where the children were just beginning to stir. Beck gathered only what he would need: his canteen, a small piece of jerky, and his knife. Everything else would just slow him down. I'll be back before sunset, he told them all. Mind what Mara says, and remember, quiet as mice. The children nodded solemnly, their young faces showing understanding beyond their years. Beck squeezed Mara's shoulder once, then slipped away into the forest, moving as silently as a shadow. For the next hour, everything was peaceful. Mara kept the children occupied with quiet games and whispered stories. She had just finished checking on Willow, whose fever had broken during the night, when she heard it, the sharp crack of a twig breaking nearby. Her head snapped up, every sense suddenly alert. That sound had come from the wrong direction, not from where Beck had gone, but from the south, where they'd seen militia tracks yesterday. Another soft crunch of snow, closer this time. Mara's heart began to pound. Someone was approaching their hiding place, trying to move quietly, but not quite managing it. She glanced at the children, who had also frozen at the sounds. They stared back at her with wide, frightened eyes. She made a quick decision. If it was a militia scout, she couldn't let them find the ravine. Better to intercept them before they got too close. She made the hand signal they'd practiced. Absolute silence, stay hidden, and the children immediately pressed themselves deeper into the shadows of the ravine. Mara moved swiftly but carefully toward the sound, using every trick she'd learned in Denver's alleys to stay quiet. She could hear her pulse in her ears as she crept between the trees, scanning for movement. The attack came without warning, not from where she'd heard the sounds, but from her left. They'd been herding her, she realized too late. A man in a militia coat burst from behind a thick pine, grabbing for her. Mara ducked and struck out hard, catching him in the stomach. He grunted and stumbled back. But he wasn't alone. 2 more men appeared, then a third. Mara fought like a cornered wolf, kicking, clawing, even biting when one got too close. She managed to bloody one man's nose and knock another off his feet before sheer numbers overwhelmed her. They pinned her arms, though she continued to struggle. "Feisty one man growled, touching his bleeding nose. "The major will want to talk to her himself." From their hiding place in the ravine, the children watched in horror as the militia dragged Mara away. Her final glance back held a clear message. Stay hidden. Stay safe. Then she disappeared into the trees, leaving only trampled snow and terrible silence behind. The children huddled together, barely daring to breathe, until the sounds of the militia faded completely. Even then, they remained frozen in place, waiting desperately for Beck to return. The sun had moved well past its peak when they finally heard his familiar whistle. The oldest girl, Sarah, whistled back, adding the 3 short notes that meant danger had come. Beck appeared moments later, moving fast but cautiously. He took in their terrified faces, the obvious absence of Mara, and the signs of struggle in the snow. "Tell me," he said simply. Sarah explained in a trembling voice, the other children adding details between quiet sobs. Beck listened intently, his face growing harder with each word. When they finished, he immediately began searching the area, reading the story written in the snow and broken branches. The tracks confirmed their account. 4 men had taken Mara, heading northwest, toward Harlan's camp, just as they'd taken the boys. Beck's jaw clenched as he pictured Mara in Harlan's hands. He knew all too well what the man was capable of. The memory of that Ute family from 20 years ago rose up unbidden. The mother's screams, the children's tears, his own shameful failure to stop it. But he was not that same young scout anymore. And he would not fail again. The light was fading from the sky when Beck finally returned to the ravine. The children had remained exactly where he'd left them, huddled together for warmth and comfort. Their faces turned to him like flowers seeking the sun, desperate for hope. Beck knelt in the snow before them, meeting each pair of eyes in turn. "Listen to me," he said, his voice quiet but filled with iron determination. "I know you're scared, but I promise you this. I will bring Mara back. I will bring Thomas and Samuel and James back, no matter what it takes." "How?" Little Willow asked in a small voice. Her fever had left her weak, but her eyes were clear and focused on Beck's face. "I know these mountains better than anyone," Beck said. "I know how Harlan thinks. And most importantly," he reached out to take Willow's tiny hand in his, "I have something Harlan doesn't understand. People worth fighting for." The children pressed closer, drawing strength from his certainty. Beck continued. "Tomorrow, we'll move to an even safer place, I know. Then I'll go after them. But tonight we need to rest and stay warm." They worked together to improve their shelter, gathering extra pine boughs for bedding. Beck shared out the last of their dried meat and hard biscuits, making sure each child ate something. As full darkness settled over the mountains, they huddled close together for warmth, the smaller children sandwiched between the older ones. Beck took first watch, his back against a boulder at the ravine's entrance. The protective charm from Elias felt heavy against his chest, reminding him of the old healer's warning about Harlan's growing ruthlessness. But the charm also reminded him of something else, that he was not alone in this fight. He had friends, knowledge, and most importantly, a family worth protecting. The wind whispered through the pines, carrying the bitter scent of snow. Somewhere out there in the darkness, Mara and the boys waited. Beck's hand tightened on his knife as he stared into the night, his mind already forming plans. Tomorrow would bring its own battles, but tonight his duty was clear. Keep these remaining children safe, and prepare for what must be done. Behind him, the children slept fitfully, drawing comfort from each other's presence. Beck remained motionless at his post, a guardian in the darkness, as the long night hours crept past. His thoughts turned to Mara, her fierce protective instinct, her gentle strength with the children, the way she'd begun to heal something in his own heart he'd thought forever broken. He would find her. He would bring them all home. The moon rose high and cold over the mountains, casting sharp shadows through the trees. In the ravine, 17 children dreamed uneasy dreams, while their protector kept his vigil, waiting for dawn and the chance to make things right. Beck finished packing his small bundle before dawn. He had left detailed instructions for the children about staying hidden and finding help if he didn't return. But when he turned to leave, he found 17 determined faces blocking his path. "We're coming with you," Rowan said firmly, his young face set with resolve. At 14, he was the oldest of the group and their unofficial leader after Mara. "She never left us. We won't leave her." Beck shook his head. "It's too dangerous. Harlan and his men won't hesitate to—" "We know what they'll do," Rowan interrupted. "That's why we can't let you face them alone." The other children nodded in agreement, even little Willow, still pale from her fever but standing straight. Beck studied their faces, not the scared orphans who had arrived at his cabin, but determined survivors who had already endured more than most adults. He saw in their eyes the same fierce loyalty Mara had shown them. "All right," he said finally, "but we do this smart. We do this together." They spent the morning studying the terrain. Beck showed them how the narrow ledges above Piedra Creek could let them move unseen, how the frozen creek beds offered silent paths through the woods. The children demonstrated their ability to squeeze through tight spaces where grown men couldn't follow. "Your size is an advantage," Beck explained, watching them practice climbing. "You can go places Harlan's men can't reach." He taught them the last crucial skills they would need. They learned to move without sound, even through dried leaves. They practiced emergency whistles that sounded like bird calls. Rowan proved especially skilled at creating distractions with thrown stones. As the sun began to set, they shared a small meal of dried meat and the last hard biscuits. Beck made sure each child drank plenty of water and rested briefly to gather strength for what lay ahead. When the moon rose, casting silver light through the pines, they moved out. 17 children and one mountain man sliding like shadows between the trees. Their footsteps made no sound in the fresh snow. Their dark clothes blended with the night. They moved as one, united by purpose and love for those they had lost. Beck led them toward Harlan's camp, his heart both proud and anxious as he watched these brave young souls follow him into danger. They were no longer just survivors. They had become a family, an army of orphans determined to bring their own home. Dawn had not yet touched the eastern sky when Beck and the children reached the high ridge overlooking Harlan's camp. 17 pairs of eyes studied the scene below, where 24 militiamen slept near smoldering fires. In the center, Mara stood tied to a wooden post, her head held high despite her bonds. The 3 captured boys huddled nearby under guard, shivering in the pre-dawn chill. Beck gathered the children close, his voice barely a whisper. "Remember your positions. Older ones, you'll lay the false trails leading north. Little ones, you have your mirror pieces to flash signals when you see my hand rise." He touched the shoulder of 2 wiry boys. "Tom, Seth, you'll handle the horses. Quiet as mountain cats, just like we practiced." The children nodded solemnly, their faces set with determination. They had rehearsed this plan until each knew their role by heart. Beck watched them slip away to their positions, pride mixing with fear in his chest. The sky lightened gradually. Below, men began stirring, rekindling fires for morning coffee. Beck raised his hand, and instantly, flashes of reflected light sparked from 3 different positions. The older children's decoy movements drew guards toward the northern trails, just as planned. Tom and Seth darted between tents like shadows, their small fingers working quickly to loosen rope hitches. At Beck's signal, they slapped the nearest horses hard. The animals bolted, yanking their stakes free and charging through the camp. Men shouted in confusion as tents collapsed and cooking fires scattered. Through the chaos, Beck moved swift and silent. His knife sliced through Mara's ropes in 2 clean strokes. She stumbled but caught herself, immediately helping him free the boys. "This way," Beck whispered, guiding them toward a narrow drainage ditch that led to the trees. They were 20 yards from safety when a familiar voice cut through the morning air. "That's far enough, Scout." Beck turned slowly. Major Harlan stood blocking their path, his revolver leveled steadily at Beck's chest. The former officer's eyes held the same cold light Beck remembered from 20 years ago. Without hesitation, Beck stepped in front of Mara and the children. The moment hung, suspended, heavy with tension and unspoken history. No one moved. No one spoke. The only sound was the distant whinnying of scattered horses and the soft whisper of wind through the pines. Harlan marched Beck and Mara into the clearing, keeping his revolver trained on them. His voice carried across the crisp mountain air. "You never understood destiny, McAllister. These children need discipline, structure. They'll serve a greater purpose under my command." Beck squared his shoulders. 20 years of guilt finally breaking free. Like that Ute family you massacred? Was that your idea of destiny? Still whining about that? Harlan sneered. They were in our way. Just like these brats are expendable if they won't obey. The gun barrel shifted toward the children hiding behind Beck. Mara tensed beside him, ready to shield them with her body if needed. Suddenly, young voices rang out from above. 20 children appeared along the ridgeline, standing shoulder to shoulder. Their fierce faces showed no fear as they began hurling rocks and packed snow down at Harlan's men. "Now!" shouted Rowan, and the air filled with flying stones and ice. In that moment of chaos, Beck saw his chance. He lunged forward, knocking the revolver from Harlan's grip with one hand while tackling him with the other. They crashed to the ground, Beck pinning the larger man face down in the snow. Hoofbeats thundered nearby. Elias Whitehawk appeared with 6 Ute riders, their faces stern as they surrounded the militia camp. "These men trespassed on sovereign land," Elias announced. "We tracked them here. The federal marshal has been notified." The Ute riders quickly bound Harlan and his men. Beck watched his former commander being led away, finally answering for his crimes. "Uncle Beck!" small voices called out as children scrambled down the ridge. They swarmed around him and Mara, faces glowing with triumph. Beck checked each one carefully for injuries while Mara gathered the little ones close. "Is everyone safe?" Beck asked, his voice rough with emotion. 20 heads nodded as they pressed around him. "We did it together," Mara said softly, touching his arm. They walked back to their ravine shelter as the sun sank towards the mountains. The children's excited chatter filled the cooling air while Beck and Mara brought up the rear, making sure no one fell behind. Though exhausted, their steps were light with victory and the knowledge that Harlan would never threaten them again. Back at the ravine, Beck stirred a pot of thick bean soup over the fire, while Mara distributed wooden bowls. The children huddled close, their faces illuminated by flickering flames. Even the oldest ones, who usually tried to act tough, pressed near for comfort. "Here now, get this warm food in you," Beck said gently, ladling generous portions. He checked on Willow, who sat propped against her favorite sister's shoulder. The Ute medicine had worked its magic, her fever had broken, and color returned to her cheeks. "Thank you for saving us," Willow whispered, her small hand reaching for his weathered one. Something in her innocent gratitude broke the last wall. Several children began crying softly, not from fear this time, but from the overwhelming relief of finally being truly safe. Mara moved among them, stroking hair and wiping tears, murmuring comfort. Later, when the little ones had drifted to sleep in their blanket nests, Beck and Mara sat by the dying fire. "I carried that guilt for so long," Beck said quietly, "watching Harlan kill that family and being too afraid to stop him. But these children..." He paused, searching for words. "They showed me what real courage looks like." Mara touched his arm. "And you gave them something they'd never had before. Hope. Someone who would fight for them, not use them." At first light, they made their way back to Beck's homestead. Smoke rose from the chimney. Elias had spread word to the neighbors. As they approached, Beck saw familiar faces. The Johnson family with blankets, the widow Rodriguez carrying a huge pot of stew, even some Ute families bringing dried meat and winter vegetables. "We heard what happened," Mrs. Johnson said, hurrying forward to wrap a blanket around the nearest shivering child. "We want to help." Throughout the morning, plans took shape. The valley could support more cabins. The Ute families offered to teach winter hunting skills. Settler families volunteered to help with building and supplies. Inside the cabin, laughter rang out as children claimed sleeping spots and helped organize supplies. Beck stood in the doorway, watching them. What had begun as a desperate rescue in a snowstorm had become something more, a calling to create the home these children deserved. In the bright days that followed, the mountain valley hummed with purpose. Beck and Mara worked alongside Elias Whitehawk and neighboring settlers, marking spots for new buildings. The sound of axes rang through the crisp air as they cleared ground for a log bunkhouse. "Miss Sarah from town says she'll teach reading twice a week," Mara announced one morning, watching the children help carry smaller logs. The Reverend Williams arrived with a black iron kettle big enough to feed 30, its surface gleaming in the winter sun. "The Lord provides," he said simply, helping to set it up. Each day the children grew more confident under Beck's guidance, learning to build proper snow shelters and winter windbreaks. Mara's strength returned fully, her natural leadership flowing as she organized their growing community. After supper one evening, Beck stood on his cabin porch, watching the children toss snowballs and laugh without fear. Their voices carried bright and clear in the mountain air. Mara stepped out beside him, resting her head against his shoulder. "The Lord sent me a family when I least expected it," Beck said softly. Inside the cabin, lamplight glowed golden through the windows, warming the night. Their mountain refuge finally, truly home. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.